Welcome. I'm so glad that we have so many people who can join us today for what I believe might be the first ever joint event between the Political Science Department and the Psychology Department and the Tisch College of Civic Life. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Debbie Schildkraut. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I would first like to thank some people who helped make this event possible today, one being the Psychology Department, in particular Department Chair Sam Summers. I'd also like to thank Jess Burns at the Tisch College of Civic Life and the political science staff, particularly Andrew Alquesta and Jimmy Pavlik. So our event today, we have Chryl Laird from Bowdoin College, and she will be speaking about her research for about 40 minutes, and then we will have Q&A. You can post your questions through the Q&A feature in this webinar format, and Professor Summers and I will then field the questions to Professor Laird at the end. So without any further ado, I am delighted to introduce Professor Chryl Laird, Assistant Professor of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College. Her research focuses on American politics with an emphasis on racial and ethnic politics and political psychology. In addition to the work she's going to discuss today, she has expertise on why some places opt to remove Confederate monuments while others do not. She studies how post-racial rhetoric shapes candidate evaluations and more. She's consulted by journalists frequently to share her expertise. In recent months, she's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR. She's been in the Washington Post, USA Today, and more. She's had a very busy semester. She teaches courses on race, ethnicity, and politics, urban politics, women of color in politics, public opinion, and research methods. Now, I'm sure most of you know that tonight is the vice presidential debate between Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris. Senator Harris is the first Black nominee for vice president from a major party, in addition to being the first Asian American nominee and the first Black Asian American woman. Black Americans have been a core constituency of the Democratic Party for decades, though their turnout rate has fluctuated in recent years, partly in response to the degree of enthusiasm they have had or have not had for the nominees. I guarantee you that you will be thinking about today's talk as you watch the debate and hear the subsequent recap of it. Professor Laird is here to talk about her recent book, Steadfast Democrats, How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior, and the book is co-authored with Ismail White, a professor of politics at Princeton University. So please join me in welcoming Professor Laird to Tufts University, and I turn the floor over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Hello, everyone. Hope you guys are doing well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen so you can see the presentation. And let's make sure all of our audio is here. Okay, so we're good to go. Yes, everybody can see? Awesome. All right. So afternoon. I hope you guys are all doing well. And so today I'm going to talk about my new book, Steadfast Democrats, How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior. And so one of the things that was really motivating for Ismail and I in understanding what we were wanting to do with this book relates in large part to something that we've all been observing in our politics, which is how African Americans engage in politics in the United States, and particularly their partisanship loyalty to the Democratic Party. And trying to understand, well, why is that the case? It's something that is very known, and particularly in the African American community, it is so known. It is something that has even been discussed and popularized within our pop culture, right? So there was a really great episode of Blackish that came on that Ismail and I both like a lot because it provides us some of that insight into understanding how people have come about learning and understanding what it means for Black people to participate the way they do with their democratic loyalty. So I wanted to play this clip because I think it sets a nice groundwork for thinking about the maintenance of this partisanship and why it is happening and also how it operates. So I'm going to play this clip from Blackish and I'm just going to let it play. You guys can see kind of how it introduces at the very beginning of one of their episodes. And it talks about partisanship in this household, in this Black family.
The earth revolves around the sun. Fact. 2 times 2 is 4. And fact. Black people aren't Republicans. We just aren't. We vote for Democrats. And it's not just an Obama thing. He could have drop-kicked this baby and I still would have voted for him. But Black people also overwhelmingly back this guy. This guy, get down now, Hell, 91% of black people voted for this guy. Fact, 91% of Walter Mondale's family didn't vote for Walter Mondale. Sure, the other side may trot out a token blackface every now and again, but the fact of the matter is being a black Republican is something we just don't do. Oh, hey, son, how was your day?
Oh, great. I joined the Young Republicans Club at school.
Fact, Junior may not be a donkey, but he's definitely an ass. Lunch for you. Lunch for you. Lunch for you. No free lunch for you. I don't want to offend your Republican sensibilities by giving you a handout. I skipped breakfast. Yeah, well, if you want to eat, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Terry, what are you doing?
Bo, we have a problem. Junior is a Republican.
Well, that's okay.
What?
So he wants to shop at Banana Republic. They have a crazy generous return policy.
No. You're not getting it. All right? He's a Republican.
A notary public? Well, that's a noble profession. Will save us tons of time.
Bo! A Republican!
A member of the Irish Republican Army?
What the
Okay. So if you got to take down a couple of fish and chip shops to be free of British rule, Dre, you got to do what you got to do.
No! Ronald Reagan, Ann Coulter, Fox News, Tea Party. Bo! Republican!
Republican?
Yes!
No!
Yes!
No!
Yes!
No!
Yes!
We don't do that, Dre! We are compassionate liberals who believe in tolerance, acceptance, open...
Yeah, whatever, but we're black, all right? That's all that matters. We're black.
When did he start believing that immigrants should go back across the border, that evolution doesn't exist?
They should.
What?
And it doesn't. That's just proper thinking.
What?
Now, what's all this fuss about?
Huh? Junior is a Republican.
Well, that's fine.
What?
He wants to be a publican, a British tavern owner. Noble profession.
No, Mama, a Republican.
What's that you say? You say as in Republican?
Uh-huh.
No, it can't be a Republican. Oh, my. Not a Republican. Oh, Jesus. Black Jesus sacrifice.
So what I really like about this clip is that there are so many pieces here that can be unpacked about how we understand Black political behavior, particularly with partisanship, right? So Junior, Andre's son, is deciding that he wants to join the Young Republicans at school, and Andre clearly has a problem with this, right? And part of that is because there's an understanding from Andre's perspective that being a Democrat is something that is greatly associated with also being Black. Right. And even in trying to convince his wife, Bo, about what the son is doing, Bo is unable to process the idea that somehow their son is a Republican, right? She has to be repeatedly told that this is the case. And from her ideological perspective, she's arguing that they are a liberal family, they have particular views, and this just doesn't make sense to her. On top of that is their grandmother, played by the great Jennifer Lewis, right? And she comes in and she is also confused by the idea that their son would be a Republican, and that she makes an argument about why this doesn't seem to make sense to her either. Like, she's stunned by it and emotional about it, and even is unable to be convinced by it initially when she's told. She also is speaking of an ideological viewpoint that is much more conservative in its leaning. So a lot of what's going on in that clip is an understanding not only of where people are and they're thinking about partisanship within the Black community, but also all the different ideological differences that we can observe. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that because I think frequently we assume that African Americans are a monolith. But if there's anything we can really take away from this clip, it's clear is that, look, from Dre's perspective, look, you can do anything you want, but you can't be a Republican, right? So you can do anything else, but being a Black Republican is a problem. And that sets up a question, because Ismail and I have been pondering about this for quite some time. And the research question that we had is, well, how have Blacks maintained this Democratic Party unity over the last 10 years? And I say that because it isn't something that seems like just explicitly that should occur, right? That this is something that has much more nuance to understanding why this is happening. And part of why we need to take into consideration this nuance, and again, what's exhibited in that clip, right, is that Black people are not a monolith, right? And what I like about this GIF here, it's from an episode of Key and Peele, where they did an episode, a segment on Black Republicans. And one of the things that they talk about, right, is that Black people are not a monolith, right? And so oftentimes, because of this partisan behavior, we assume a uniformity across all kinds of different other indicators about Blacks that is just not true. So one of the things that we know is that there's a lot of economic diversity within the African American community. So if we look at it over time, since the civil rights movement, we can see that there is definitely divergence of different subsets of the Black community that are moving economically into upper brackets, while there are others who have kind of remained flat in economic gains. Additionally, we can see that even on the liberal and conservative ideological continuum, that we can see that African Americans are much more variable in their liberal or conservative identification, and that has changed over time as well. And if we even look at other types of measures of conservative and liberal perspective within a policy space, we can see that when it comes to governments creating jobs and income, even support for health insurance, or even government action for the poor, government intervention also to reduce economic inequality, that African Americans are diverging, like in a lot of different ways in how they are viewing these policy perspectives and these positions. Right? We can also see this when we look at support even for racialized policy. And so in this case, when we look at government intervention to deal with social and economic positions of African Americans, we can see divergence. We can also see this when we think about things like integration within school systems and in education, and also even the obligation of the government to improve living standards for Blacks. And we did this analysis over the ANES as well as the GSS, and looking for kind of indications of where we can see differences in how Black individuals have expressed their views on politics. And the takeaway from all of this is Black people are more economically and ideologically diverse than we often give them credit for. And so again, we ask, well, then how are we able to see this maintenance? Well, some might ask, okay, but there are other things, right? In political science, we've talked about other types of things that have explained Black political behavior. And our go-to on this is linked fate, right? So what about linked fate? Like, how is that going to be fitting into the understanding of partisanship? Isn't that what explains it? Michael Dawson wrote the book Behind the Mule in the early 90s. And in that book, he lays out a framework of linked fate that comes off of the understanding of a notion of a common fate, which we can find in the gender politics literature and the gender literature, looking at women's consciousness, and also in a piece by Jackson and Gerwin that looks at, called Hope and Independence, that also looks at this notion of common fate amongst African Americans. But Dawson's seminal work Behind the Mule really lays out this idea of a linked fate, right? And that this is a good point, right? Linked fate supposedly is supposed to explain a lot of what we see African Americans do in politics. And it does do some work, right? It does provide us explanations, for instance, for support for candidates who are African American, right? So sharing of the same racial identity. It also provides us support for understanding and predicting likelihood of them to support certain race policies. And a notion of linked fate is this belief of what happens to the group having some influence on individual lives. Well, when we do the analysis and look at its predictiveness for partisanship, we just don't see the same thing. So we looked at numerous data sets and the probability of someone saying that they are a Democrat relative to their height, relative to their expressed linked fate. And we see here in all the graphs that we did this analysis for a flat line. So this idea of common fate not being the thing that actually predicts partisanship. So that isn't necessarily that we need to throw linked fate out, right? It does a lot of other work. And in fact, I think we need to spend more time investigating that. But what we do know is that it's not necessarily doing the work we think that it should be doing for partisanship. And so what we argue is that the maintenance of democratic partisanship in the last 50 years is something that we really should think about in a much broader sense that is not necessarily individual based only, But in fact, our argument is that there is a social network component that is not understood, right? And that Black partisanship is maintained through Black social networks. And so a lot of this talk is going to be me laying out the theoretical framework for how we get to this argument, and also laying out the evidence that we show in the book, at least some of the evidence that we show in the book, for what we see as indications of and strong evidence for this framework really being what is behind a lot of what we're observing. And so what we lay out in the text is this idea of a racialized social constraint, right? And so we're thinking about how this social network process would be operating for African Americans. And so we define this as racialized social constraint as a process of enforcing the norms of Black political behavior. It includes well-defined racially specific social rewards and penalties, which are used to compel compliance with group-based expectations of political behavior. So that's a bit jargony, but essentially what we're trying to argue is that there is an understanding within the African American community, especially since the Civil Rights Movement, that there is a consolidation of African Americans around the Democratic Party, particularly because of their positions on civil rights, and additionally because of the opportunities that has granted for African Americans to pursue Black interests, as well as even gain access to power within a constrained system as a minority group trying to have influence, right? And so a norm has been created within the group, not only at that point in time, but that these norms of political engagement, particularly that are coming out of the Civil Rights Movement around the Democratic partisan loyalty, is something that we can see being enforced and understood, and that it's enforced and understood within Black spaces. And it is a well-defined norm, and also it is well-defined in what people are expecting you to do, and in addition, what they will do to you in response to what they see as either defiance of the norm or even a strong commitment to the norm, right? And so the way in which the social process works is that those social rewards and penalties really do a lot of enforcement of the loyalty to the partisanship, in situations where people would have reasons, like I pointed to earlier, for potentially rationalizing why their loyalty to the Democratic Party may not be something that they necessarily want to do, right? They may have policy positions or issue positions that would make them basically see the other party as potentially a way for them to reach those goals, right? Or see those goals more manifesting within their politics. And so we argue that the socialized constraint is really where we see the work happening in the maintenance of this. And we lay out 4 points of this framework, right? And so I'm going to kind of go through each of these points, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, we argue that there is an existence of a well-defined norm of Black political behavior, and that this doesn't necessarily just begin within the Civil Rights Movement, but that if we look historically about how African Americans have engaged and get politically, we can see where the norm of collective action and collective behavior to try to achieve goals for the group is something that has been happening for quite some time, especially in the space when it comes to partisan politics. Additionally, this is going to be tied to a behavior that is either public or verifiable. So the ability for racialized social constraint to be effective is going to be one in which people can observe what's going on. And although voting is done in private, and I'll talk a bit more about that, we argue that there's a lot of discussion and conversation, like we just saw in the clip from Blackish, where African Americans are aware and conversating and talking to each other about their political positions and about their views on politics and their partisanship. And so it is something that is public and verifiable. We also argue that the predominantly in all Black social networks are going to be essential for this racial social constraint to operate, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, and also that there's a potential for sanctions or rewards. So if we just begin with this first point of the theory, the existence of a well-defined norm. So Ismail and I decided we would go back and look historically and do kind of a historical analysis of thinking about and looking for points in which we can see clear examples of these well-defined norms of Black political behavior. And we can see this early on. There's been a long history of that of Black collective behavior. So if we even just look in the period of slavery, and here I have this piece of Harriet Tubman. It's a painting done by the Black painter Paul Collins, and here he's depicting Harriet Tubman trying to help a set of enslaved Blacks escape from a plantation in the midst of slavery, right? And that there is reasons to believe that at that time, there was an understanding of the collective action and the benefits of that, especially when trying to emancipate oneself from the institution of slavery, right? So if you're trying to pursue these opportunities or options, right, the collective action is going to be necessary for one to be able to do this. It's not only one individual, for instance, Harriet Tubman leading individuals, but it's an entire operation of people working together collectively, and that this operation also requires people to do this in a manner that allows for them to not be seen by, for instance, the masters, and not be found out in what they're doing from the masters. And that would lead to then responses that would be not ideal and could even be fatal for them. And so we can see instances where the collective behavior is happening within this antebellum period. And particularly, right, this has been noted by individuals about how unique this was to see African Americans doing this, right? And that this is something that can be observed in some of even the politics of what's going on amongst various slaves and their discussions around what you do, for instance, about an individual who's decided to inform the master, inform whites about the potential of particular Black individuals who are enslaved, trying to escape the plantation. And so Frederick Douglass even writes about this in some of his work, and we cite to it in the text, where he makes a statement about what he observed in an instance of a plantation where somebody was seen as an informant on the plantation and potentially putting at risk Black people who are trying to organize. And so he says, "I found the colored people much more spirited than I had supposed they would be. I found among them determination to protect each other from the bloodthirsty kidnapper at all hazards. Soon after my arrival, I was told of circumstances which illustrated their spirit. A colored man and a fugitive slave were on unfriendly terms. The former was heard to threaten the latter with informing his master of his whereabouts." And recall, again, we have fugitive slave laws that are at this time, right? So these are laws that are in place that is going to basically criminalize somebody for emancipating themselves from slavery through escape, right? So straight away, a meeting was called among the colored people under the stereotype notice, business of importance. The betrayer was invited to attend. The people came at the appointed hour and organized the meeting by appointing a very religious old gentleman as president, who I believe made a prayer, after which he addressed the meeting as follows: "Friends, we have got him here, and I would recommend that you young men just take him outside the door and kill him." With this, a number of them bolted at him, but they were intercepted by some more timid than themselves, and the betrayer escaped their vengeance and has not been seen since. I believe there have been no more such threats, should there be hereafter. I doubt not that death would be the consequence. So in this case, you can see where active effort is done to try to suppress somebody who is threatening the collective efforts of the group, right? And even if we think about the period of Reconstruction, one of the things that Ismail and I found in this time is when the franchise is now granted to African Americans with the Civil War amendments, African Americans are now in a position and an opportunity to have their voices heard at the ballot. And what we see, right, is the rise of many Black elected officials coming into office during the period of Reconstruction, right? And they are all coming in under the Republican Party, right, seen as the party of emancipation. And the loyalty to the Republican Party at that time is clear, right? And that these collective behaviors that we see from slavery are translating also into the ballot box. And that enforcement of the idea that the support needs to be put behind the Republican Party is noted in a number of texts where there is open discussions in those pieces that talk about how African Americans were calling out other Black individuals who were potentially not complying with the idea that they need to put their support behind the Republican Party. There are even stories of women, Black women who do not have access to the franchise at that time, but who are basically shunning their partners, shunning their husbands, even at polling places, calling out Black men who they think are not going to go along with the norm of how they're going to engage in the politics at this time. And so again, here we can see a history of this collective behavior and a clear understanding that the group interest is of priority and that the group needs to be put forth first. And there's an understanding of where the group is and you need to be in line with this. We can also see this in the period of Jim Crow. And I have this image here just showing of this mother and daughter outside of a colored entrance which was very common at the time in Jim Crow. And this is a photograph from Gordon Parks. And here again, we can see, right, the efforts of collective behavior being vital, right, for the efforts for trying to achieve equality for African Americans during the civil rights period, right? So with the challenging of the Jim Crow South and the institutions that it created and how it operated under the law, African Americans are organizing. We see Black churches, Black spaces, Black officials, and Black prominent individuals within those spaces being the leaders, right, to provide the support for and the guidance for a lot of the collective behavior at the time. And many of those individuals who are doing the ultimate sacrifice being rewarded with a substantial amount of reverence and seen as those embodying the most commitment to trying to achieve equality for African Americans. And we can see that in the discussions around people like Martin Luther King, even Diane Nash, who organized the Freedom Rides, like wrote a will and had others write wills as they were getting ready to go and do those freedom rides because they knew that they were going to be potentially putting their lives at stake for this, right? So the idea that collective behavior is an understood thing and that these norms of being collective for the group being quite clear, and those who decided not to often being called out or punished as a consequence of this. And even in modern times, right, although there has been discussions, and Michael Dawson has even written about, and others have argued that, you know, we've seen the falling down of many of the Black institutions that used to be the vital spaces, like for instance, attendance at Black church and Black churches potentially not being as influential as they used to. But we've seen other spaces develop as a place where collective behavior is not only discussed, but the norms of how people are supposed to act, especially within the space of partisan politics, are clear. And so I have this example here of Steve Harvey being slammed by Black Twitter for hurting his feelings after the Trump meet and greet. And Steve Harvey fires back at Black Twitter for basically coming after him. Right. And I wrote a lot of this section in the book about Twitter because Twitter is like one of my favorite places to kind of interact with. But in this discussion here, Steve Harvey is called out because he associated with Donald Trump, right? And tried to make inroads with the president. And at that time was president-elect. So he went to Trump Tower and there was a significant backlash, right? And Steve Harvey is someone who has become popularized more in the mainstream through things like Family Feud and a lot of his game shows and his talk show. But before he was mainstream Steve Harvey was basically making his space within the African-American community and media space, even somewhat of the Chitlin circuit. So this was through his stand-up comedy, for instance, on Def Comedy Jam and other places, as well as his radio show that comes on one of the Black networks, right, that plays a lot of Black radio and programming. So he was really called out for this and had to even apologize, like did an entire episode of his radio show apologizing to some degree, but also being stunned that he, of all people, was being called out for potentially defecting from the understood norm of behavior, right? So when we look over time, Ismail and I needed to figure out a way to establish, right, that a norm is present at all, right? And so one of the things that we wanted to do is look at, well, how long have we seen the maintenance of this Black partisanship, democratic loyalty, and particularly when we look at how long, I mean, how high is it, right? So this is some of the data that we have from the American National Election Study, and we can see that African Americans report high levels of vote share when it comes to I'm sorry, this is an exit poll, pardon, the ANES is on the next slide, but the exit poll showing the support for the presidential vote that happened, and then also over time, and then also when we look at the ANES, individuals who self-identify as Democrats, right? And between Black and whites, we can see that identification for African Americans is quite strong and consistent, right? So in both cases of the ANES and even in the exit polls that we can see of 2016, up from 1976 to 2016, we can see a consistent loyalty with the Democratic Party. So there does seem to be a clear norm of understanding and a long history of this collective behavior. So then when we think about these two second points, the behavior that is public or verifiable, and also being in predominantly or all Black social networks, right? So again, here, when we think about the behavior being public or verifiable, a lot of times we'd be probably relying much more on partisanship in terms of its verifiability, and that voting, right, is a private act, but very much informed a lot by public information and public interaction, right? And we believe that these networks and the understanding of the norm within the network and the enforcement of the norm within the network is what leads to even a private act like voting being in line with the expectation of the group and the expected norm of behavior, right? So it is public and verifiable, and also in predominantly all Black social networks, right? And that is a key thing because for this group to be able to maintain an understanding of this norm and how the group should operate, right? One of the ways of that enforcement socially would be to call out individuals, for instance, like I mentioned Steve Harvey, for when they step out of line, right? And the ability to do that would be heavily reliant on your likelihood to be interacting with other Black individuals. And that means then you would be more worried about potentially creating problems with those social interactions as a result of you stepping away from the norm. And what we find in looking at the data, and in this case, we use the 2013 PRRI American Values Survey, and what we find here, the racial composition of Black and white social networks is fairly homogenous, especially for African Americans, right? The chances of them being in contact with other Black people are very high in their day-to-day. So for instance, in the reported social networks, we see that 8 out of 10 people that Black people report they're interacting with are Black. And even for whites, right? They are also in more homogenous racially social networks. However, we know that politically, in terms of partisanship, they're actually more likely to be partisan, more diversity in the partisanship. So even though it's racially homogenous, partisan-wise, it is not as homogenous, it's much more heterogeneous. But for African Americans, you're going to find homogeneity on race, and you're also going to find homogeneity when it comes to partisanship. Additionally, we did other analysis looking at localities and areas where we see large Black populations. And we still see heavy amounts of racial segregation for African Americans. And even when reported from African Americans in a number of surveys about their likelihood to interact with Black people in their day-to-day, many of them are indicating that beyond their own social networks, that when it comes to shopping, when it comes to going to the store, when it comes to doing things day-to-day, just kind of as they go about their day with people, that they are more likely to be interacting more so with Black people than anybody else, right? So even within those spaces, due to residential segregation, they're still interacting with largely Black populations, right? So again, this provides a stepping stone for people to do this norm enforcement. And then finally, right, there's this potential of social sanctions or rewards, right? And we argue that the idea of defecting from the norm being something that can create some issue for people is because they would be concerned about the social sanction. And there is an awareness that the social sanction exists, right? That people will be called out for that. And even that Steve Harvey example, and even the one that I brought up from Frederick Douglass, you can see instances where people are being called out for stepping away from what is understood as the collective behavior of the time. Right. And so when we did some analysis and looked at this and did some small surveys ourselves, what we found is when asking people at the time in 2012 about their support for Romney or Obama, we can see that African-American voters are more likely to have people in their family and social circles that would be concerned about them reporting that they would be supporting Romney over Obama than we can see of white individuals. And so if you look here just at the bottom even of this graph here, you can see that no, none of my friends or family would have cared if I supported Romney or Obama, and white voters say 45.6% of their family, like they can 45.6% them reported that no, they don't believe their family would have problems, while only 20% of Blacks, right, where more so many of them are saying, yes, I do have family members that would have a problem with me if I voted for Romney over Obama. So there is some family pressure, familiar pressure, friends and interactive contact that they're having that says to them, people would have an issue with what I'm doing, very similar to what we saw, for instance, in that episode of Blackish that I showed. Additionally, perceived support amongst individuals, and we looked at perceived support of friends and family for supporting Trump among Black and white Obama supporters, right? And so this is some subsequent data that we took to look at it within the 2016 context. And here again, we can see that Black voters are reporting that, and their Obama voters are reporting that they are going to be dealing with much more lack of support amongst their individual family, amongst their networks and friends and family than we would see of white supporters, right? So again here, not that white supporters don't necessarily have people who would be or not favorable of some of their decision-making in their politics, but African Americans are definitely facing much more heavier weight with regards to how people are seeing them within their social networks. So we argue in the book then that the ongoing importance of social belonging within the Black community and the primacy of other Blacks and social ties that bind provides unique leverage for politics focused on group interests, right? That social belonging is key, and that how one is seen by the group, especially when it comes to this particular norm is very, very important because it has a long-standing norm, and it is one that is seen as essential in terms of collective behavior that we observe from African Americans. And so one of the ways that we wanted to test this was we had to figure out, well, how do we test social pressure? And a lot of our time, and I can talk about it more in the Q&A if you guys want to know how we thought through this, but a lot of our time was spent trying to figure out how do we operationalize this into an empirical way? Well, one of the ways that we did this was using some survey data that provided us with what we call a kind of quasi-experiment. So one of the analysis that we did was of 2012, the American National Election Study, and what we were able to do here is have a baseline. So we were able to look at individuals reporting of their partisanship in face-to-face interviews versus if they are just reporting their partisanship online. Right? So this is actually a fairly conservative test, right? These are people that are being interviewed face-to-face by potentially somebody more than likely somebody they don't know, right? Somebody that's been hired by the ANES. They may be from the geographic area where that person is from, but the likelihood that they know them is probably very small. And we controlled for many of those factors that we could with this data, since it's not exactly an experiment, but provides us some kind of experimentation a bit. So we call it a quasi-experiment, right? So the online data, what we see here in that report from 2012, and 2012 was the only time when you really have this comparison to be done. Prior to that, in the cumulative ANES, we were using non-Black interviewer, Black interviewer, but again, we still didn't have the baseline. So what we can see here with the online data and the control is that the reporting of Democratic leaning is at about 85% amongst African Americans when they're reporting on their partisanship, right? 9% independent and 5% Republican. But then when we look at them being in the presence of a non-Black interviewer, right, very similar results coming in between the online comparatively to this non-Black interviewer condition. And then when we look at the Black interviewer condition, what we see is a sizable increase between people reporting the Democratic leanings versus what we saw in the other two conditions, right? So 96.4% of people are reporting that they are Democrats. So even in a simple case, a very conservative test, just looking at being in the presence of an interviewer, what does that do to partisan reporting? And we argue that this is just one of many indications that there is an expectation amongst African Americans that they should be voting with the Democratic Party, and that even the presence of somebody who is Black is serving as an embodiment of an understanding of that norm, and also somebody who is placing some bit of pressure on an individual to be more in compliance with that, even if they have beliefs, ideas, issue positions that would make them maybe think about and rationalize doing otherwise. Right? And so one of the things that we did was we did an experiment as well. Like we did an actual experiment because the survey data was useful and it provided us a lot of insight and a lot of analysis, but we also wanted to be able to control for certain things that we wanted to examine. So one of the things that we did was this HBCU experiment. So we went to an HBCU in the South and historically Black college and university. And why we went there is because we wanted to test the role of institutions in norm enforcement. Right? And so we set up an experiment where we told people that we were part of this voter project, and in the project that this is an opportunity for people to be able to donate to campaigns, and that we were actually going to be giving them the money. So they were never going to be using any of their own money, and that they were going to be given money that they could be able to donate to actually not even campaigns, but to organizations that support those candidates. And that when they were going to be giving this money, that for every $10 that they donated, right, that they also would receive some compensation themselves. For every $10 that they donated, they would also receive $1. And then as part of the experimental design, right, we created a bit of an incentive, because that idea of getting money back for every $10 that you give was something that was only attributed to Mitt Romney, right? So we created the incentive so that individuals would have to now deal with a decision-making task, right? Do I do the donation to Mitt Romney so that I can get money in my own pocket? Or am I more likely to give to Obama because I understand what we're supposed to do? I maybe even agree with what we're supposed to do politically. And so I'm going to go ahead and align with that, right? So when no incentive was given, right, when people were giving the allocation of money and they had no incentive to get the money back for themselves, we see a lot of donation given to Barack Obama. right? But then when the incentive was provided and they could then decide how much they would give, but Mitt Romney would be one, if they give more to Mitt Romney, they would then receive money. We see a decline in people's giving to Obama. But then we included a next condition. And in this next condition, we said, okay, here's the incentive with this setup of Mitt Romney, right, being the incentive. And they were told that it was being randomized where that incentive would be applied, but it was always going to be applied to Romney, right? And in this case, though, in the third situation, they were given the incentive and told about it, and then also told because of campaign finance laws, we would also need to disclose this in some sort of public forum. And so in this case, we would put publishing it in the campus newspaper. So this is historically Black college, and now suddenly people are going to know that you donated money to Mitt Romney. And what we then see is that even with the incentive for people to get money in their own pocket, we see people's awareness of what others will see and what others will know about their behavior. And we see a return back to levels of giving to the Obama organization that are comparable to that in the control, right? So that was just like one of our tests, right? Just to see like what would happen. And again, here, it's a fairly conservative test. We were able to leverage the 2012 campaign to do this. But again, right, just simply suggesting that people at this historically Black college would be aware of what you did was enough to get basically people to go in compliance with the norm, right? We also set up another study, right? And this is just a visual of how this study is laid out that we conducted at a Midwestern university. And here we were trying to do a situation where we were gonna have people do a decision-making game, again, kind of similar to what we had done at the HBCU. But here, what we were wanting is for individuals to be paired with another person in the room that they were gonna be making that decision with at the same time, basically, right? And so we had Confederates as part of the study. So outside the room is the interview location. At the interview location was either myself or Ismail, and we would be standing there and we would be talking to one person who is our Confederate and one person who is the participant. And the person was going to be paired with the participant was going to be paired with either a white individual or a Black individual, and that was also going to be gendered match, so either male or female. So if you're a male participant, you're paired with a male, either white or Black. If you're a female, you're paired with a Confederate that's either white or Black, right? And they were told, hey, we're doing this thing, we're with this voter project, and we're going to be giving you an opportunity to donate to the campaigns. Here's $10. And when you go in the room, there are two boxes, and one is for Obama and one is for Romney. And you can put $1, or you can put money, as much money as you want into either one of these boxes. You don't have to put any money into either of these boxes, but for every $1 you put into one of the boxes, we will attribute that to this organization that's supporting one of the candidates. Additionally, in the candidate you've indicated. Additionally, if you don't put any money, that's fine. You can just walk away with the money and you can take it for yourself, right? So we had a sign-in sheet, and then there was a contribution location. So people basically came inside of the room and made this decision. And the Confederate, who had been outside the interview location and being told of the same information as the participant, was told to walk into the room with their $10 and donate all of the $10 to Obama and say that out loud. Say, I am giving my money to Obama, and put the money in and then exit the room, right? Thereafter, we would then go in after the participant made their decision about what they're gonna do with the money and count up the money that's in the box for the participant, right? And so there we were able to see how much are people willing to donate now that the norm has been explicitly stated to them, right? Which we previously didn't necessarily have. And so what we see in the situation here is that when there's no Confederate present, so when someone is just going in baseline to make this decision, they're given the money, no one's gonna know what they're doing, they did not give as much money to Obama, right? So 21% gave Obama less than $5. We see a lot more of a lower donation because they're basically taking the money for themselves, right? And that with a white Confederate in the room, we see a bit more people giving to Obama, but again, not statistically significantly different from what we see in the Confederate, the control condition, right? So even with a white person saying, I'm giving all my money to Obama, that didn't necessarily lead to an increase in donations. And then finally, when we look at the Black Confederate condition, we can see that there is a heightened level of donation for Obama, with more than 50% giving more money to the Obama campaign, right? And so that being an increase that we think is attributed directly to the fact that someone is Black in the room with individuals, and that they are then also expressing the norm, and people are now having to make the decision about what they're going to do after now being aware that there is a Black person indicating to them what is expected of them to do, right? And so these all are just examples from the book, and we have a lot more other things that we talk about in there of just how we try to understand and operationalize and test for racialized social pressure. And we believe that we actually are able to exemplify what we are talking about theoretically with a lot of what we were able to test in our theory. And so within the things that we conclude from the study are a few things. So one of the things that we got asked about a lot has been around voting, and voting is a private act, but we argue that social pressure still matters, right? That network effects can take hold long before an individual reaches the voting booth. And many of the events that lead up to the act of voting are socially structured. And there's other work that talks about that. So if you're familiar with the work of Betsy Sinclair or Liliana Mason, they talk about not only the importance of social networks and understanding voting even for white populations, and in Betsy Sinclair's book, it's Neighborhood Effects, and for Liliana Mason, she talks about the identity of partisanship and how important that is. We argue that a similar thing can be thought about here, that many of the events that lead up to the act of voting are socially structured, such as norm definition and norm enforcement of public political expressions, and that the constant sanctioning of people who defect, like what we saw happen to Steve Harvey, or rewarding people who are making more of a commitment, our norm commitment and rewarding those individuals, right, can lead to an internalization, right, of the norm consistent behavioral practices. Basically, people start to internalize what is expected of them, and voters will bring that with them into the voting booth. So we can't be in there with them, but we can understand potentially what they're cognitively thinking about and their motivations behind that based off of these expectations. We also know that social pressure can be an effective tool for not only reining in individuals, but particularly Black elites. So if you think back to the income graph that I showed you earlier, right, for Black elites, they seem to be the most divergent, right, in income. And there could be a concern there, especially when we think about even Dawson's work, because that was the motivation behind his, is, as Black people are becoming more educated and more economically heightened, right, growing in their economic gains, right, how would we expect them to behave in their politics? Well, previous theories would say that they would start to diverge from the democratic norm, except we see them not necessarily do that. And why is that the case, right? And part of that is because the social pressure is an effective tool for keeping people who could really come up with rationalizations that would put them in line with the Republican Party less likely in doing that. And if someone decides to, that they will be called out. And so recently, this just happened. So I just added this slide not too long ago. But Meg Thee Stallion, the rapper, went on SNL and performed. And at the end of her performance, or in part of her performance, she calls out Daniel Cameron, the Republican AG in Kentucky that was responsible for presenting information to the grand jury in the Breonna Taylor case, which ended up not leading to more criminal action beyond the one police officer with an endangerment, right, for people who were in the apartment next door to Breonna who had bullets in their wall as a consequence of his shooting his gun, right? And so here on her display wall of her performance, she says, Daniel Cameron is no different than the sellout Negroes that sold our people into slavery. So she is openly sanctioning a Black elite who has decided to defect from expectations of the group. And that the social pressure that is happening may not necessarily even change Cameron's position about where he is, but it will serve potentially as something that will keep others from defecting from the norm, because now they are seeing what happens to somebody who decides to do that. Further, we argue that the racialized social constraint, which I just abbreviated here as the RSC, could be used to explain the behaviors of other groups. And so one of the things that we speculate about in the conclusion is potentially understanding how this is relevant for looking at other groups. What parts of our framework do they meet in order for us to see the ability for social constraint to be an effective tool of leveraging compliance with the norm expectation. And one of the groups that we talk about in the conclusion are Southern whites, right? And the way in which the Republican Party has taken on a lot of the identity of the Southern white positioning and even visual representation, a lot of the platform, and even the rhetoric and statements that we hear from the party being something that is embodying a lot of Southern white positioning. And particularly when it comes to things on race relations, we can see that, and that the Republican Party has been much more embracing. And so I even pulled these images from one of the Trump campaign rallies where we can see, right, not only are the Trump signs being held up, but we can also see images of the Confederate flag. And one of the things that we argue with that in thinking about Southern whites is that the imagery that is being pushed forward and this Southern identity becoming more synonymous with the Republican Party is something that is going beyond the Southern region. I live in Maine, and I am always stunned by the number of Confederate flags that I see driving by. And typically when I see them, they are also somebody who has a Trump bumper sticker or even a Trump flag hanging next to it. And so even outside of the Southern region, right, we can see some of that similar behavior being shared, and also, right, then a commitment to the group, a commitment to the norm and those expectations. And finally, just to think about it, people have asked, well, okay, you know, Cheryl, well, how is it possible for this norm to not be as effective anymore? Like, when are we going to see it change? When are we going to see it do something different? And Ismail and I basically postulate you would basically need to figure out a way to end racial segregation to do this. And because so much of this is reliant on these social networks and the racial homogeneity of said social networks, that the ability to minimize the effectiveness of the norm would require more diversity in those networks. And that is not going to be something that is going to be easily accessible when residential segregation has predominated the way in which we have designed communities and spaces within the United States. So I can take questions at this point, and also hopefully you guys enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Summers to handle the first few questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Laird. That was fascinating talk. I want to echo Professor Schildkraut's introductory comments and celebrating this first joint venture between Tisch and the Department of Psychology and the Department of Political Science. And so thank you, Professor Laird, for helping us kick that off in such interesting fashion. So I do have the pleasure of getting to ask you some of the questions that our attendees have been sending our way. And I guess the first one we're going to start with is a question about turnout. And you were alluding to these issues as you discuss the public versus private aspects of some of the behaviors that you're focusing on here. And so I guess the question here is, to what extent is the social pressure in question that we're talking about limited to the pressure of being a Democrat versus voting democratically? Do we have a sense of the ways in which that play out? And for that matter, your opening clip, you know, we see a family with diverse ideological viewpoints. And so are the Dre's and Bo's of the world who seem ideologically more aligned maybe with the Democratic Party more likely perhaps to also turn out as opposed to Ruby, who does have the identification as a Democrat, but some variability with her ideology as well. So I guess the question is about turnout, and does that vary also within the variable ideologies of the African-American voters?
Yeah, so turnout's a great question, right? And I think right now, and even within the last couple of years, right, one of the things that has been discussed particularly has been 2016, right? They've talked about turnout and African-American turnout declining relative to what we saw in 2008 and in 2012, and like what happened at that moment. And I think one of the things that we have to be careful of, and I'll just as kind of stipulate where Ismail and I are positioned on this, but essentially we are like, well, 2008, right, and 2012 are unique circumstances. Right? Obama was on the ticket. Obama was the nominee. Obama is the first Black president. We can't treat that as if that's normal. That is an anomaly. It is historic. The turnout rates we see of African Americans are directly tied to the fact that that was a historic moment. And then what we see of 2016 is basically them coming back down to where they were in like 2004, right? So Black turnout, in my view, didn't decline necessarily as much as it reset to where it normally sits when there is a white candidate and not a historic moment on the ticket. With that being said, right, I think one of the reasons that turnout becomes a big question as well, right, is kind of people's motivations, right? Like to what degree are they going to feel inclined to turn out? And I think that in 2016, we don't know exactly everything that was going on in the minds of people, but at that time, I know that, for instance, individuals were not feeling as strongly as one may have wanted them to feel for Hillary Clinton. So the turnout wasn't necessarily as high, but the norm is very helpful because I think the norm does a lot of work for African Americans, not only with this expectation, right, but it is something where the collectiveness that it's already going on around that behavior is something that can be translated into turnout opportunities, right? So we can see more mobilizing happening because of that. We can see more efforts being done for individuals. We can see that certain populations, we didn't do a gender breakdown in the book, but from some of the data that we were looking at that we did analyze in there, African-American women tend to be the stronger turnout when it comes to practicing of the norm, and also the strongest norm enforcers, right? So they are some of the ones that believe the most in the idea that this collective behavior needs to happen, and also that people need to be in compliance with that. I think potentially what our missed opportunities are campaigns that may not be leaning heavily into those social networks and really going to the on-the-ground spaces and those contact points and meeting with those groups to get the turnout that they need in the moments that they need it. And I think that potentially was a failure that we saw happen in 2016. Because when we look at something like the Doug Jones race in Alabama, that special election, that is clearly a turnout situation, right? Like turnout is the only way that you can see that happening with him winning in that race. And that heavily relying on grassroots organizations, Black women in particular, being the ones at the helm. So I think if anybody is most motivated with the norm and with turnout, it's Black women. And additionally, people need to lean heavily or into the social networks campaign-wise, because they probably would find some fruitful avenues for them. I don't know if Biden is going to reach turnout like Obama either. I doubt it. I don't think anybody really is since Obama was the first Black president, but he would want to aim for instance, between where Clinton was and where Obama was, would be his best guess there.
Great. Thank you. So another question we have from the audience has to do with our ability to differentiate how much of the effects that you're talking about here are born from an affinity and allegiance to the Democratic Party versus an aversion to the other party in our two-party system. I mean, the clip that opened was as much about not being a Republican as it was being a Democrat, and these are in a two-party system with two major tickets on the ballot, sort of a zero-sum game. But can we tease that apart? Do we know how much of this is an affinity for and an allegiance to the Democratic Party versus the stigma that you were talking about and showing regarding supporting the Republican Party in the contemporary United States?
Yeah, no, I think from where Ismail and I were doing in our analysis, I think we concluded that it's a pro-partisan behavior. Like it's a pro-partisan behavior, right? So it is for the Democratic Party because African Americans are being strategic in their thinking, right? Like there is obviously a lot of reasons why the Republican Party doesn't appeal as much to African Americans at numerous points in history, right? Particularly because of their position on civil rights and racial policy. But African Americans are also aware that the Democratic Party has provided them with avenues for them to be able to see some realization of much of what they are wanting as a collective, which is wanting certain policies to be put into place, wanting elected officials and opportunities for them to be with the seat at the table, essentially, that the Democratic Party is an opportunity where they can at least feel like to some degree, some of what they're wanting is being heard, right? And so it is less about distancing themselves from the Republican Party and much more about trying to really have a lot of leverage and positioning within the Democratic partisanship party, right? Having more positioning within that space. And so I think from the stuff that we are observing in our analysis, that this is where we're seeing this, right? That it's not an expressed anti-Republican, although people are aware of the symbols of the Republican Party. And I think Tasha Philpott's work out of the University of Texas really speaks a lot to that, where she talks about the party image of the Republican Party and people's issue with it. But people do seem to be articulating, right, understandings that being pro-partisan And doing this particular strategy is what is going to be effective for this group of people to be able to have a voice within a system that doesn't necessarily allow for their voice to be heard. It's a little bit of both, but we would argue, I think, more heavily that it is much more pro-partisan than it is anti-Republican, and that when we look at these other points in history where maybe you aren't necessarily looking at a partisanship aspect to it, I think particularly like the first instance with slavery, right, you can still see where that collective behavior is pro a goal and not necessarily anti some other thing, right? So obviously they're anti-slavery, but it's like pro, like we need to get out, like we need to do the work to get out of that institution. So that's, I think, where we position ourselves on that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to do a little tag team, and I'll throw things back to Debbie to ask another one. But so the next question I want to ask, and again, if you're in the audience, we feel free to submit additional questions as well, is a question about to what degree is this politically advantageous for African Americans? And might there be some sense in which it would be to the advantage of the African-American voter or the African-American community if there were greater variability? Is there a risk here that the Democratic Party can take the African-American vote for granted and focus on, say, white swing voters? And is there an extent to which there's a downside to the sort of norms that you're talking about here?
Sure, right. And I feel like a lot of that work, if we look at like Paul Freimer's writing on electoral capture, right, this is one of those arguments, right, that Black people are not necessarily getting as much as they can get. I mean, the entire situation is suboptimal for Black people, right? Like this is all suboptimal decision-making that is happening for them, right? And so they are constrained by the system itself because it is a two-party system, winner take all, Duverger's law, all of that in play, right? So the way to optimize, more than likely for them as a minority group in a majority-based system, is going to be to put their collective power as much as they can in one location, right? And that is a decision that they've made strategically. It is not one that necessarily everybody will want to do, but if the goal is to try to address the things that are affecting Black life, overarching, regardless of, you know, the variation that we can see, right, that this is the best effort and the best way to try to do that, right? So I think it's a major thing for them to make that decision. And then further, you know, I think this election is a great example of how, yeah, they aren't being taken for granted necessarily at this moment. I mean, I think the primary season in particular just showed the power of what this collective effort does, right? So in the lead up to the South Carolina primary, we see that in New Hampshire, Iowa, Nevada, that there were other candidates who were seen as the front runners. At that time, we still had Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg leading the front. And there was a point we were talking about, like, the Biden campaign was dead in the water. Like, they were, like, South Carolina was high noon for them. And there you had a primary electorate that was going to be 60% African-American. Once they decided that they were going for Biden, and even with the other entrants in the race there at the time, I think it was like Tom Steyer as well as Michael Bloomberg, and there was concern or thoughts about what that would do to that race. The full weight of this collective behavior really became influential. Like, Biden's candidacy is only happening because Black people basically put their support behind him in the way that they did, and thereafter in states that had about 25% Black populations in the primary electorate. And so now what we see in the primaries are discussions that are happening that we've never really seen in the mainstream, like reparations. Even, I'm not like that old, but like when I was in college, I remember talking about reparations was like fringe. Like, I'm 37, but like, you know, we were in college, I took a class like Blacks in the Law, and I remember the teacher being somebody who was part of the reparations movement at that time. She also was like a Black motorcyclist, which I thought was pretty cool. But nonetheless, right, she was talking about reparations, and it was seen as like this thing like that is on the fringe. And yet at the primary debate, lots of people, they're asking questions like on the stage to the candidates about reparations. Like, that doesn't happen unless you are concerned about where Black people are seeing the party, and that your base, which is Black, a lot of Black voters, right, are seeing their voices being heard in the issues that are being asked. And so I think that that's key. And 2016, right, the losses there also, I think, also are a big thing, right? If you don't motivate this base to turn out, what is the likelihood that you might lose the electoral contest? And as we saw in 2016, it can happen, right, if you don't do that.
So I'm going to turn things over to Debbie.
All right. So you ended your talk by talking about the case of Steve Harvey and Black Twitter as emerging as a new space for enforcing racialized social constraint. But couldn't social media also provide an alternative space for Black conservatives to find each other and weaken the extent of social constraint? You said, you know, one way to break this down is to end segregation, and that's not likely to happen anytime soon. But could this contribute to that in some way?
So this is an interesting thing. And in fact, I have sought out some of these people. So I remember, I think it's called Turning Points, the Candace Owens organization, and they had a number of rallies, and they even had something at the White House a couple of years, maybe a year or two ago, in support of President Trump, and it was Black Trump supporters, a lot of young people. And I've ended up starting to like kind of pay attention to some of them on Twitter and follow them. And I would say, yes, for many of them, social media has served as an opportunity and a space for them to align, right, and collectivize as a subset, right, of the Black electorate. But I will say that they deal with a lot of social sanctioning in doing it. So even if they were maybe in a private group that nobody would see, I think that, and they may be, I mean, I'm not in that group, but if they are, then that is one way for them to be collective and be together with one another. But there is a clear understanding from the larger set of the group that there is not approval for this behavior, right? And that is not being seen as something. And so they were regularly dealing with challenges to them where Black individuals were openly basically sanctioning them for their decision to align with Trump, and that those people who seemed to support them were actually white individuals who are seeing them as examples of free-thinking, independently minded Blacks. And it's interesting that that is even an articulation, an argument about what they are doing, because, you know, if you've read any work on, or are interested in reading work on Black ideology, if you look at people like Michael Dawson's work, Black Visions, or Melissa Harris Perry's book, Bibles, Barbershops, and BET, the idea that there are ideological differences in the Black community, and there are even Black conservatives. I mean, even Ruby in that Blackish video, like the grandmother she's a Black conservative, right? Like so it's not as if that's a new thing. That is not a new behavior. And I feel like sometimes it's expressed as novel. So there's always that contingent. And they have also rallies. Corey Field's book, Black Elephants in the Room, talks about like a Black Republican convention. But it doesn't necessarily take hold, because for other Black people to be willing to collectively decide to do that, they would have to change more than likely their social network. So they would have to worry about the sanctions that they would receive from others and not necessarily be worried about that. So where they rank their social ties will be key, because some Black people don't rank their social ties as important to them. In fact, they may even put, for instance, like money over their social ties, like monetary incentives or monetary. And so there is something there for that, because Black Republicans do have money that can be made for themselves. Candace Owens' book, I think, is like at the top of like the bestseller list on Amazon, because she's a Black woman who is not a Democrat, right? She's an open Trump supporter. So there are, and I think she prioritizes that. She also is in a social space that is predominantly white, right? So the people who are other Trump supporters are also going to be white individuals. Some of the talks I've seen that she's given, it's predominantly white audiences. Her husband is white, and so she just isn't in a space where the enforcement of these norms are the same. And I think that that's what someone would have to be able to do to be able to maintain it, even if they decide to collectively come together.
So this may be our last question, depending on how much time we end up having, and I'm going to go methodological on you. You mentioned in your talk that there were lots of interesting discussions that you and Ismail had about how to actually test some of these things, and some of them didn't make it into your study or your book. Can you talk a little bit about ideas you have that either didn't work out, or are there other thoughts that you had about how to actually study this?
So yeah, because we both do, I was actually, so it's interesting because this book project is happening while I'm a graduate student at Ohio State, and Ismail is an assistant faculty member at Ohio State. So we kind of had a meeting of the minds as he is advising me on my own dissertation, which is on stuff similar to this, but not this. And then also working on this other project that ended up being our first piece from it, which was our APSR. And so in our sit downs, there was a time where we were thinking, we're like, okay, so what if we have people come in and tell them that there is some entity. I don't even remember exactly what that entity would be, but basically maybe a company or people want you to work, for instance, as a slave on a plantation setup, like a mock plantation setup, right? Like, you know, because they do these things, like these Civil War reenactments, and they often hire Black people to play slaves, right? So like, you know, and you know, so what would be your willingness to do that? And what would you be willingness to do that if people knew you were doing that? And what would you be your willingness to do that and behave in certain ways that would be problematic to people? I mean, like we thought of a number of things with this, and then eventually we were like, this isn't going to work. But we did do like a small little test of it where we had another Black graduate student come in, and we incentivized it too. Like, you know, you would be doing this, you'd be affiliated with people that are not favorable, particularly Republicans, who would be organizing this thing. You know, are you willing to participate? And would you do it for the money? And, you know, we got varying responses from that individual. They were like, I mean, I'm a grad student and I'm broke, so I kind of do need the money, but I don't necessarily want people seeing me do this thing. But we also thought that the plantation situation was a lot and realized that that may be more over the top than we need it to be to get this done. And even initially when we were first starting it, we piloted with a few students the design that we did and thought about, you know, well, how much of an incentive do we even need to give people, I think was another thing. So, you know, we had to look at some of the work that's been done on, for instance, like giving in altruistic types of scenarios. So there's some work out there that talks about social psychology and political psychology of people giving, and also what's incentives are needed for people to do certain things. And so we had to think, you know, well, how much money can we give somebody to make them defect? We thought about the population of people that we would be using. We thought that students were really good because if we were using a small incentive, they are more likely to be economically constrained. And so that incentive will seem, what's $10 to somebody with a full-time job is different than $10 to a college student who's like, I can buy Chipotle today now. Like, so that was a good thing to do as well. But by far, yeah, the plantation scenario, there was something around that for a minute. And then we were like, that's done. We're gonna set that aside and not do that. But we do believe that it would probably have exemplified some of the same things we were talking about. It would have just been more provocative.
So I will squeeze in one last question. When I read your book, which I absolutely loved, and I've been talking about it, I feel like everybody I see. But one thing I came away feeling is that it leaves me feeling like, you know, let's say I'm a Democratic consultant reading this, I might come away with a perverse incentive that segregation is good for the Democratic Party. Keeping people in networks where they don't interact with people who aren't like them helps us. So I'm just interested in hearing some of your thoughts on that.
I mean, one could walk away with that. I mean, that's not that's not totally wrong. That you're the first time that you kind of brought that forward. I think, yes, one could walk away with that. But I would also be very clear on, you know, for Black communities, you know, segregation and racial isolation have done so much for Black communities around Black culture and what it means to be Black and that identity. I mean, I live in Maine. Maine is like 93% white. Like, I think it's like, you know, competes with Vermont on a regular basis to be the whitest state in the nation. And yet still, right, I, even away from Black people, have an understanding of how the group is supposed to behave, and particularly in this political space, and what is expected and understandings of that. I'm also a Black elite because I'm a college professor like you guys. And so that puts me above average in terms of income, in terms of education level than most Black people. But yet I still have an understanding that because being Black and Black identity is still so essential to who I am. So even with segregation being a key component to this, I also think there's something to be said about Blackness and how much that's defining for people and their identities, and also, you know, how that would operate even in the absence of segregation. And social media is one of those spaces, right? Black Twitter isn't like www.twitter.com/Black. Like, it's out there in front of white people. Like Megan Thee Stallion's sanction of Daniel Cameron is on SNL, right, which is much more likely to be watched by white audiences, right, than Black audiences. So, you know, there's still these ways that we can see people operating with that, even when they're not in racially segregated spaces. But yeah, I mean, someone could walk away with that thinking. I'd be a little concerned because, yeah, the hope would be that people wouldn't say, let's maintain racial segregation, but we have a lot to address with it because it is residential based.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I know I'm going to keep talking about this book and thinking about it throughout the whole election. So congratulations on the book, and thanks again for being with us today. And thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. Go vote and, you know, watch the debate tonight. See you guys.
Bye.